Good day, everyone. This is the CDH Dad, and
The CDH Warrior.
we're back for another episode of Mondays on Mondays. We're actually enjoying just a beautiful fall day. We're actually in East Tennessee, so that gives you an idea of our location. Just the general information. We have started this just to have a forum to discuss issues that come up with families that have children with special medical needs and special issues. From the background, for those of you may not know, for almost 3 decades, my family has had my son, my first, who was a congenital diaphragmatic hernia child. At that point in time, the survival rate was 30 to 50%. The percentages on that have increased tremendously. Part of that was some of the changes in the protocols and new medical technology available.
To put that in perspective, now the average survival rate, global survival rate, is still around 50%, but the U.S. national is between 70 and 95%, if I recall a statistic I read recently.
And just based on really the location of where you are. So those are things that do make differences. The general disclaimer, and let me go. My wife and I had a son that was a CDH, congenital diaphragmatic hernia. After his birth and the medical issues that we had there, we actually discussed whether to have another child or not. We'll actually bring that up in the discussion we'll have further about how to make some of those family decisions and discussions that you may need to have. But we did not know of any genetic issues, concerns. We had our second child. She was born without issues. Everything was going extremely well. And at less than 2 years old, she developed a condition called aplastic anemia, which is basically an entire shutdown of her bone marrow system, and required a bone marrow transplant, basically a stem cell transplant. So we went through those rigors and issues and all the medical anomalies related to that. So that's part of the reason we bring this up is, we've had a lot of medical issues and issues with trying to raise children into adolescence, their tweens, teens, and into adulthood. And what we try and do is just be able to have a forum where we can discuss some of the things outside of the basic medical concerns that you have of how do you get on with life and normal existence. Once again, our last and most important disclaimer is we are not medical professionals. We do not have backgrounds in medicine, just a lot of experience. And we're not psychologists, social workers, anything along those lines. Although we have had to work with early intervention and a lot of those issues that have come up during the time. So once again, we welcome you back to Mondays on Mondays. And if you would please.
Let's roll the title.
Welcome back, everyone. As I've said in the past, we don't necessarily have a set script or program that we follow in this presentation. We kind of listen to some of the communication, chatter, questions, and discussions that come up within social media with the groups that we're involved with. I know my son is very active with the CDH
Stars and Angels,
that program, and is actually on the board with that group. And I stay close to aplastic anemia survivors and also graft versus host disease, which is a long-term issue related to bone marrow transplant. just to give you the gist of that is, if you have an organ transplant, you're basically going to have to deal with the blood system wanting to reject a foreign organ for the rest of your life. It's a long-term issue. With bone marrow transplant, your blood system is now considering everything in your body to be foreign because it comes from a different DNA, a different structure. Yeah. And in that case, there's usually a couple of years that you have to go through anti-rejection. And then we found out after the transplant that graft versus host disease is quite common. And basically your blood system will attack the foreign body's organs, and it can attack the heart, the liver, the kidneys, the lungs. But one of the more common is to do with skin and the mucous membrane areas and things like that, which was good and bad. That's what my daughter has, which means it's not quite as severe as in some cases, but it's one that we have to watch and monitor over a long term. Just to give an idea, what we're looking at this point, and some of the discussion that came up, is how do families discuss parents that had a child with a condition? How do they discuss a lot of the issues about the future of a family and those types of things that come up?
I mean, I've been bringing this up in discussions over the past couple of weeks from the adults, from the survivor's perspective of, okay, dealing with a relationship, dealing with telling a spouse about what you've been through, pretty much everything in that respect, going through a relationship. And I don't know if it'll be this week or next week. One of the next hard discussions I'm going to have is what to do if you want to have kids, because that's an honest discussion that needs to be had.
Right, and it is a serious discussion, and I know your mother and I had this discussion because we did quite a what was available at that time, trying to review if there was a genetic component that contributed to your CDH. And from what we could find, we did not find anything that showed an anomaly. And with CDH, typically what will happen is a child with CDH may also have other anomalies. And it's a subset of many other conditions, which could be that are genetic issues. And, you know, childbirth is a really miraculous thing when you look at it, because you've got so many different body systems that have to be generated just through the natural process. And it's amazing that we don't have more defects than we do.
I'm trying to remember, because there's a statistic, and I'll post it in the comments section. Is there was actually a study done 5 or 10 years ago. It's been fairly recent that it was published, but on the odds and the I don't want to say the recurrence, because it's not recurrence, but what are the odds of having a child with a birth defect? And I think ultimately it's like 1 in 40.
It's fairly, when you start adding in, when you start adding in that, you know, CDH is, I think, in the top 15 defects, but it's in, and it's a 1 in
2,500.
1 in 2,500. But then there's some others that are much more common. So once you add those together, yeah, there's 15-20% would add to basic statistics on that. And and I'm an engineer, so I'm going to look at the numbers and those type of things. But just in the general discussion is, if a couple has a child, and there are a couple of different scenarios. Okay, if you have a child that has a birth defect, we say CDH, but it could be a lot of other different anomalies and things like that. I mean, spina bifida, cleft palate, Down syndrome, a lot of those type things. Okay. Do you need to look at the genetic components and see, is it probable or highly possible that you could have another child with a defect?
Or in some cases, was it just a complete fluke?
Was it a fluke? And that's, in your case it was. So do you continue on and have another child? And that's a point, as I say, part of what we want to bring up in this forum is points that couples and families need to discuss and need to be open about. And I don't know the exact statistics. I know dealing with social workers and counselors in hospital settings, it is quite often that couples break up and divorce when they have a child that has a health condition, because it is difficult for them to deal with. First of all, just marriage in general, and then having a child, and then having to figure out how to do that if you've got non-standard issues to deal with. How do you go through that? And one of the discussions I have with a side group is that, we discuss what is normal, but if you really look at it, we brought this up previously, is in general, with the normal bell curve, only 2/3 of us are normal, and of that, 1/3 is going to be a little bit to one side of the normal, and the other is going to be a little bit to the other side of normal. There's not that perfect fit in the middle. So in the gist of that, these are things that couples and families have to discuss and figure out how they're going to go through that. In our case, we chose to have another child. And genetically, we looked at the numbers. My wife and I both were STEM, scientifically based individuals, so we looked at the statistics, felt comfortable with going forward. Our daughter was perfectly healthy until 18 months and then contracted aplastic anemia, and at this point we were not able to find a genetic reason for that. But it also brings up another item to discuss in terms of, if you have a child with a health condition, do you go forward and have another child? But in my daughter's case, it was one that we needed to look at, okay, could we find a suitable bone marrow donor for her? And your first thought is, oh, well, my wife and I could be donors. We've got a son. He could be donors. If you look at the statistics, there's very low probability that either of the parents is going to be a good match. Used to be that it was a 6 out of 6 HLA match, which is good. They've got some other anomalies that they look at now in that. But in general, if you have a 5 out of 6 or a 6 out of 6 capability, that's great. If you had an identical twin, that would be perfect. But it's not a perfect world. So you've got to look at what are the options.
And to put in perspective, if I remember from what you all have told me about that issue, all 4 of us were 2 out of 6 equal mismatches for each other.
Right, it's one of those things.
We were all mismatched.
Yeah, I mean, none of us was really a good donor for any of us. And that's to be expected, because you've got, parents, when you get a child, it's going to be a mix of the two. So it's half of one, half of the other. Now, which of those 6 is which? So in general, you may have a 3 out of 6 possibility. A 4 out of 6 is not unheard of. 5 out of 6 or 6 out of 6 is very unusual.
Yeah.
And in particular, now if you're dealing with families that where there's different family and ancestral backgrounds,
Yeah.
it becomes difficult, because then you've got to try and find some family that has a similar genetic to what you have.
Yeah.
And it can be difficult. In our case, we were able to, excuse us, but we were able to find.
Oh crap! Where'd it land? Okay.
He went. Sorry about that. We had a wasp
Sorry.
that interfered with our presentation today, but that happens. But in our case, we were fortunate that there were a couple of umbilical cord banks where people would donate or store the umbilical cord's blood from their children. And then that could be used if needed for that child later on. But it's also one that it provides access to be able to harvest some of those cells and be able to use those. In our case, we were able to find 2 that were 5 out of 6 matches.
Yeah.
And in the midst of that, one was a boy, one was a girl. Our daughter was a girl. And we discussed that with the doctors, and it was better to use a female rather than a male, because there are different hormones and other issues that can be a problem in that transplant and in the long-term issues with how the body deals with that.
And
So those are things you need to look at.
now it's pretty common for cord blood banks. They're pretty much all over. But at the time, that was close to unheard of. That was stem cell research in its very infancy.
Right, and there were a lot of issues with stem cell research, but the stem cells in the blood system are an incredible creation, because a stem cell can basically evaluate your body's system, determine what is needed, and then can help create whatever that is.
Yeah.
Up until just prior to my daughter's birth, it had been one that they would harvest the actual bone marrow
Yeah.
from the donor, which was a painful and much involved procedure. And then they would inject that into the bones of the recipient, which again was a lengthy and involved procedure and had issues. Then they determined that it was actually the stem cells in that
As
marrow
opposed
that
to
they
the bone
harvested
marrow itself.
that actually started the process. So it was miraculous to watch that in her case. But it was also a discussion that we had to have with the doctors. In our case, many times with aplastic anemia, it can progress over months and years. And generally you look at the condition of, okay, how much medical intervention is required? How many transplants are required, or transfusions are required? Because each blood transfusion will change the mix of your blood system. And if you have to do that over several dozen transfusions, then at that point it becomes difficult to do a transplant, because it is hard to put a primary driver when you've got multiple genetic blood cells in there that are all trying to make the decisions on what's happening in the body.
And we don't often talk about blood cells actually having genetic components to them, but they actually do.
They do, and there's a lot involved in this, and I'm not going to go into details, but one of the things that we did discuss and evaluate is, and many parents that have those types of conditions, I know particularly with aplastic anemia, is, do you have another child to look at the potential for having a donor for your sick child? We did discuss that, but in our case, it was one that my daughter was diagnosed in February, and in May had the stem cell transplant. So it was just a few months, and part of that was she was having multiple transfusions. So every week, every 1 to 2 weeks. So it was impacting the viability of a transplant working. And since we knew that we had a viable 5 out of 6 match, and it was a female, we chose to go that route, because if we'd chosen to have a child, we're looking at the
9
time
months,
involved to conceive,
plus
9 months, and then going through that and all the evaluations, we're looking at a couple of years of her having to deal with her health condition.
Yeah.
And at that point, her transfusions would have been at a point where it wouldn't have worked. But these are very detailed, in-depth, and heart-rendering discussions
Yeah.
that families have to have about these types of issues. I'm just relating what we had in our lives. I know there are others that have similar type things that they have to go through. So we're not giving answers here, but we are bringing up the questions that need to be discussed.
Yeah.
And part of this is the reason that a lot of couples and families have difficulty is these are in-depth discussions that are not part of normal conversation, and people are not quite sure how to deal with those. So we just wanted to bring that up as a topic. We've kind of told you from our standpoint what we've gone through. If you have any input, responses on that, you can respond to us. I know you have an email address that you'll provide.
Mondays on Monday 4 at gmail.com is the email address.
But in that case, thank you again for another Mondays on Mondays. Hopefully everyone is enjoying some beautiful weather. Have a great fall.
Have a great day.